So what I'm going to be talking about today are some principles of science writing, and I should put the sum here, because obviously this list could go on and on and on, or the considerations in putting together a good science article are kind of endless, but I've listed out just some, what I see as kind of some essential points that I always think about when I'm approaching a story. I also just want to initially talk about my career path very briefly, just in case that's kind of helpful information for anyone. I know you're all kind of grad students, maybe thinking about your futures. So yeah, this could be helpful. And then I want to briefly talk about just why I choose to write about science, kind of in particular to write about science rather than do other forms of science communication. And then I'll move on to these principles. And also I'll say that hopefully the principles will help everyone. Maybe some will be helpful more than others, depending on what you are actually planning to do in your career. So I know not everyone on this Zoom is planning to actually be a science journalist, but I think a lot of principles that apply to science journalism would also apply to talking about your own research, blogging, creating a science video, or just telling stories in general in your life. So first, just a brief history of my career. I think I sort of started with reading A Brief History of Time as a 13-year-old. Coming across it in the bookstore. I read it and was just instantly hooked on physics, planned to be a physicist from that day forward. So then I went to Tufts University for undergrad, majored in physics, did research in nonlinear optics, as Avnish mentioned. Then took a year off, but then went to Berkeley, which had always been kind of where I dreamt to going to grad school. And so when I got there, I really thought I was going to be a physicist, had no doubts. And then somehow within the first, half of the year, kind of doubt started brewing under the surface. And in the break between the two semesters, basically I had this one sleepless night where I realized I wanted to be a physics writer rather than a physicist. And I was so sure that the next morning I called Berkeley and dropped out. And literally never looked back. I do think it was the right decision, even though it's kind of the craziest thing that I've ever done. So then skipping more steps, so I started a blog where I was just writing every day, and I tutored physics students to make money. I started freelancing a little bit, and then applied and got an internship that was a dual internship at Science Illustrated and Popular Science, these two magazines owned by the same media group. And so I moved to New York, did this several-month internship, got a ton of experience and loved it. And then an editor at Popular Science moved to this website, Live Science, and he was in charge of this new, what was then an independent site and is now part of the Live Science site, called Lifestyle Mysteries, where basically I was writing science articles to address common questions that people have that they might search for in Google. And I would go out and interview scientists and find a very satisfying, answer to that question. So it was actually kind of a cool website, even though it's a little bit of a goofy name. And so then from there, I found out that the Simons Foundation had this idea for kind of a, they didn't really know what it was, but they wanted to do some kind of science writing enterprise. And so it sounded cool. I got the job there, and then the editor-in-chief got the job just before me. And so the two of us were the first employees, and we basically launched Quanta Magazine soon after that. So, and I've been there ever since, and I love it there. So why write? You've probably all been talking a lot about the reasons why it's important to do SciComm generally. This is kind of the way I see it, is it's good for society. I think given the pandemic and reporting around that, it's clear why it's important to have good science communication. But I think it's also important for scientific progress. So oftentimes, I think that the scientists themselves don't really sometimes see the larger forest for the trees, and that actually putting together, reporting by talking to a lot of people and figuring out how the different parts fit together in a certain research area, and then putting out a story that kind of threads it all together can be very helpful for the scientists themselves. And also finding important research and writing about it well so that other scientists actually know what was shown and what happened, which then might subsequently influence their work, I think is important as well. So I think there's many ways in which SciComm just helps the scientific process. I also think that, why are we here on this earth? Well, no reason, but we are here and we want to have the best lives possible. And I think learning about the world around us is a way to do that. And so I think, like, I read about science partly to enrich people's intellectual lives, and also because for similar reasons it enriches my own intellectual life to learn about the latest kind of developments in our effort to understand the universe. But so there's a lot of great SciComm approaches out there, and a lot of them might feel, I think, easier than writing. Writing can be quite agonizing, as I think a lot of writers will admit. And also I think it might seem like sort of an old-fashioned medium. And so why in 2020, write instead of putting out a podcast? But I would say that I think of it as a medium that has stood the test of time. So, and why is that? Well, I think writing has a very high information density. So, in a 2,000 word story, which takes a ton of time to report and research and put together, to figure out how to condense all of this information you have into a concise format, like a 2,000 word story, there's a ton of information in there, and it's all in a 30 kilobyte file because, these are bits of, the alphabet, versus a 20-minute video would be like 150 megabyte file. A podcast, if you transcribe the script, it would be just many, many thousands of words long and might contain less dense information. So I think this is one reason why writing is such a time-tested medium. But then also a written document is searchable, so it's easier for people to, in future, just come across it when they're looking for something that interests them. And I think also writing is robust to technological changes. So if you look at an old website, sometimes all the pictures are broken, but the words are there. And so you come across this thing that was written in the 90s, and it's still useful to you. So I think for all of these related reasons, writing has a long-lasting impact. What you've crafted will just be around forever. Okay. So now, again, kind of take from these principles what you will that would apply to the form of science communication that you're personally planning. I think the principle that I'll start with is just one that everybody probably is aware of as a principle, which is show, don't tell. So, if you're wanting to describe a scientist who you've spent time with, don't say they have an impatient manner. Say they pressed the elevator button 5 times while we were waiting for the elevator. So these details are more informative than just kind of abstract description. So in that spirit, I wanted to go through the rest of the principles by actually talking specifically about a story of mine. And this has also just been something that I found very useful when I heard other writers kind of actually going through their stories in detail and explaining why they did certain things the way they did. So the story that I chose is called What No New Particles Means for Physics, from 2016. I chose it partly because I think it illustrates a lot of the principles I want to talk about, but partly this was the story that won the American Physical Society's Science Communication Award. And it also, I think, is somewhat striking because the story is about a null result, but it's still, I think, a pretty dramatic, kind of exciting story. And so I think if you can make a null result exciting, then you can make anything exciting. But so what the basic gist of the story is that the Large Hadron Collider in Europe, it looks, smashes particles together to try to produce new and bigger particles, if any, actually are possible and exist in nature. So it tries to discover new particles. It turned on like a decade ago, found the Higgs boson, but then didn't find anything else. Physicists really expected the Higgs boson to come along with all of these other particles that would kind of explain and complete the structure of particle physics as it's currently known. So, it would fill in these puzzle pieces that currently seem to be missing in order to make the whole structure make sense. But what they did is they turned on the Large Hadron Collider and it found the Higgs and then nothing else. And then they upgraded it to higher energy, explored there, and again found nothing else. And so then physicists were faced with what they termed their nightmare scenario, which is they have this incomplete picture of the universe and they don't have any more clues, and they just blew all their budget on this like $20 billion collider, and they're probably not going to get another one anytime soon. So big dramatic situation. So I think probably most important principle, not just of science writing, but of writing in general, and maybe even just of talking, using language, is that you want to create tension, then resolve it. So what is a story? A lot of people have thought a lot about this, but a very convincing answer that a lot of people would give is that it has tension and then resolution. So you set up some question, hold people on tenterhooks, and then eventually resolve the tension. But you have to wait to resolve the tension at the end. It's very important. So if anyone has gone fishing, you know that as soon as your line goes slack, you've lost the fish, right? You have to keep the tension there in order to hold the reader on so that they continue to want to read the story to the end. And it's one of the most difficult things, I think, in figuring out how to tell a story or write a story, which is how to convey early on what the story is about and convey that it's about something interesting and that there are new developments without giving away what the new thing is or the answer or resolution is too soon. You do a lot of, I think, in the structuring of a piece, a lot of it is going to kind of taking things out of the beginning and putting them down and making the structure of the introduction as spare as possible. And it's like, which details do you give right away, or what do you give away right away? That's enough. And anything else goes further down. So there's 3 interrelated tensions in the article that I showed you before. First is just physicists can't find new fundamental particles. They want to, so there's a tension. And these are just like this other font. It's just excerpts from the story. Another tension is that the universe seems unnatural without the new particles, right? And naturalness is a principle that the story talks about a lot. And then lastly, theorists and experimentalists see the situation differently. So theorists are just pulling out their hair, and experimentalists are like, we turned on the machine, it did exactly what it was supposed to, we gathered huge amounts of data, it put precise limits on all of these things we were looking for, and said they don't exist, and it's a clean answer, and it worked. So who cares that there's no particles in there? That's not the point. So the resolution, which the piece kind of tries to not fully realize until the end is that the experimentalists have it right, that no new particles showing up is an answer, even if it's not the ones that theorists were hoping for. So it's actually a very profound answer, has them rethinking what they thought they knew about naturalness and kind of how the universe might work. And they've gone back to the drawing boards, and there's a lot more work to do. So I think these are just a couple of quotes in the story that kind of illustrate this. The bottom quote is the kicker of the story, the very last thing. And it kind of, this is a theorist talking, and he's saying, yeah, they're right. Like, we need to get over this, kind of. So can unresolved tensions ever make good stories? Because you might wonder, well, I want to write about dark matter, but we don't know what it is. So what's the resolution going to be, right? So many things we want to write about in science. There's not, the real resolution hasn't arrived yet because they're still doing the research. Well, the answer, unfortunately, is that not really, no, and it doesn't make a good story. But usually within the umbrella of the big unsolved mystery, there's a story with a resolution, and it's just a matter of thinking about, like, what is that story? So, you know, I want to write about dark matter. I mean, it could be something more minute in there, like, oh, the leading theory of dark matter doesn't really fit with these observations, but then they did a new simulation and it suggests, oh yeah, the theory and observations do fit actually. So, you know, something kind of more boring like that, or it could be this physicist wants to know what dark matter is, and in the end they came up with a new way to look for it, you know. So you kind of have to just identify what is my tension and what is my resolution. Okay, nextly, hang your story on a news hook. So in the piece in question, here's a paragraph that comes quite high up. The news has emerged at this conference in the past few days in presentations. So a secret here is that talk of the nightmare scenario had actually been going on for years, right? There had been previous iterations of data releases that didn't seem to hold much promise in them. But there was this hope, and then the experiment was upgraded, and so there's kind of hope sprang eternal and anew. And so then there was this big data release at this conference when it felt like the community was like, okay, this is it. This is the nightmare scenario. So your story needs to have a crystallizing moment. And the reason for that, I think, is, for having a news hook, is that readers are busy. They're not lacking in reading material. So you have to tell them why a story needs their attention right now, or else they'll put it off to later. So it has to really feel like this urgent matter. Types of news hooks, study has been published, a trend has developed, an event took place. These are things you're going to want to mention very high up in your story to get people, right? It's part of the just drawing people in, that's how you catch the fish, I guess. I think one confusion around this is that, or maybe not confusion, but imagine you want to write about a line of research, and the big paper that came out, on this in Nature was like 2 years ago. And since then, there've just been like more minor things. So you're like, oh, I missed the boat on this big story. Not necessarily, right? If the big paper came out, then probably there's a lot that has happened in response to that since. So the new development doesn't have to be the most exciting development in the history of a line of research. You can tell the story by going through all of the past events, but then you just always want to trace the line up to the present so that it feels like a story that is happening now. right? So just wait to tell a story at the right time when there's a news hook. I could have talked abstractly about the nightmare scenario in a story, but it really needed to wait for that conference and that kind of crystallizing moment. All right, next. So identify the deep question behind the research that you want to write about. This is kind of in story selection. It's partly about story selection. Like if I'm trying to figure out what to write about, and I hear about a new study and it sounds kind of interesting, I need to kind of drill into like, is this actually interesting? Is this furthering our understanding of some deep question that I care about and that readers generally care about? And if not, it's just maybe not going to be worth putting the effort in to tell that story. So you always have to connect new development, even if it's not completely answering that deep question, you have to connect the effort to this question that really is driving the scientists ultimately. So in the case of this, what no new particles means for physics, I could have seen the story as, oh, an atom smasher in Europe didn't discover anything new. Well, that doesn't sound very interesting. Why would I write about that? Well, it turns out that this development really connects to a very profound question that everyone would care about, which is, why is the universe the way it is? Is it all an accident, or is it inevitable that it had to be the way it is? So that's the tension that's kind of behind this development and behind the angst that the scientists are feeling, is that, you know, without these new particles they were looking for, the ones they know of, their properties seem unnatural. Specifically, the properties of the Higgs boson seems unnatural. It shouldn't have the properties it has unless there are other things kind of balancing out basically the things that are seen. So if it's unnatural, then you wonder, how could it be unnatural? This is the universe we're talking about. Well, if the pieces are all haphazard and the only way that it, you know, could have gotten this way is just by random chance, then we have to be one universe among many, and the properties of the Higgs had to basically, the reason we observe those properties is because if they were different, then the universe would be so different that like galaxies and planets wouldn't form and we wouldn't exist. So that accidental properties of the Higgs are needed for us to be here. But that is pitted against this other view where the properties are totally make sense, and it kind of almost couldn't be any other way because it all is such a perfect structure. And so then you would think, well, this is the only universe that could possibly exist, and maybe there isn't a multiverse and it's not all random, right? So like there's this kind of, I kind of embarrassed that I didn't explain that very well on the fly, but like it's basically there is this deep question underlying this development that I think you can make anyone care about. And so if that's there, then you just have to, the challenge is just to explain to people well how the new thing relates to the deep thing, or the new or kind of somewhat more esoteric seeming thing relates to the deep thing. Okay, fifth principle is that you want to convey scientists' passions, motivations, and emotions. This is very much related to a lot of the other principles. I mean, show, don't tell, you know, explain what the tension is. All these things basically come through if you're showing why the scientists are doing what they're doing. So, you know, science has this reputation for being dry. Don't really know why, but you have to make people care about it by utilizing their natural empathy, which is that they care about people, and they'll care about the research if they understand why the scientists care about the research. So like when you're interviewing scientists to put together a story, like ask them why they care, ask them when they started caring. So figure out what is motivating them. And then also, you know, when you can convey their emotions, then it makes what they're saying become more memorable, because that's just how we work. Like we remember emotion more than we remember facts. So in this story, there's just a lot of quotes here that kind of convey that this is actually an emotional thing for the scientist. So again, just having the kind of tension of the story come out through the quotes and through their emotions is what I'm trying to go for. I kind of said this before, but often the scientist's motivations provide the tension for your story. So like, it's as simple as the scientist wants to figure out X, and then the scientist figures out X, right? Like if you find a story that's that straightforward, then great, just go for it, you know? Obviously, sometimes it's not that simple. But then also, I want to say that, you know, if you're not planning to actually interview other scientists, but rather write about your own work, either in a blog or a book or any format, you have to talk about your own emotions and your own passions and drives. And that's going to work as well. Okay. So 6th is take the shortest explanatory path. So this one's really about like, how do you explain complicated science in simple terms? Something that I always keep in mind is that I don't have very much room to do it in. You know, everyone's busy. Again, they could stop reading your story at any moment. And they don't really need to know the ins and outs of, you know, how the experiment worked, or the steps along the way from the, you know, just steps along the way all the time with, you know, the process itself, say. So just what do they need to know? Think about that. And then just try to find the straightest path from the stuff they already know to the thing that you are trying to explain to them. And so I think just when you look at your prose, anything that's not really helping, just take it out. Anything that you can, if you can just figure out how to make it shorter, that's always, always better. So things that don't help are obviously jargon. You don't really have to tell people what the scientists call the thing. You know, unless you're going to be using the term throughout the story, just don't tell people, just skip that. Extended analogies are a real pitfall. You know, instead of wasting 500 words comparing the thing you want to explain to the economy, and you have, you know, this thing is money and that thing's interest rates and so on, just no one understands the economy anyway. Like, just explain the thing itself, you know? Yeah, just explain the thing. So as opposed to metaphors, I think turns of phrase can do a tremendous amount of work for you. So just coming up with like very concise, very kind of witty ways to say things, using kind of colloquial language, or these phrases that, you know, humans have come up with that carry a lot of meaning already, just does a lot of work for you, because people already hear that phrase and kind of instantly know what it means. And I'll talk, you know, give some examples in a minute. But so also mechanistic explanations. If you're trying to say how an experiment works, or how, you know, the data was collected or whatever, say this cell bump, you know, this molecule bumped into that thing and it turned left and hit this thing, and then that caused a flash of light to come out, and that's what was detected. So just things bumping into each other is really, I think, ultimately the way that humans understand like what's happening, like local cause and effect. And so I think try to get your explanation in those kinds of terms. So in this piece, you know, I bent my own rule to explain this concept of naturalness by, using this tug of war analogy. And I mean, I've explained naturalness a lot of times, and it's quite tricky to explain it. But so this time I talk about that the Higgs mass is like the center of this rope of this tug of war, and the particles are pulling it in both directions, and yet it stays in the center. And so why are the two teams evenly matched? It has to be that every particle on the left comes with a particle on the right. And that's what they thought they were looking for, the particles that were the opposites of the ones that they knew of, right? So they were looking for why there was this balance, even though it didn't seem like there should be balance there. So, you know, it's not 500 words, but yeah. But what I much prefer, rather than that kind of thing, are turns of phrase. I was looking for a couple examples in this article, and there weren't a ton, but something like a white knight particle is what I'm saying. So that phrase, white knight, we all know, you know, that's coming in at the last minute to save the day. You know, that's what these researchers were looking for, this particle that, you know, they thought they had their nightmare scenario, and they just wanted, they were just hoping that something would turn up, you know. There's a lot conveyed there. And then in this other quote, just saying that these particles have energy, they collide, it provides a lot of raw material to beget new giant particles, if any exist. So in there, like calling the energy raw material that could produce particles is kind of a way that where I didn't have to say how the experiment works. You know, I didn't have to say, well, it turns energy into mass through E equals mc squared. You know, if they have a lot of energy, then when they bang into each other, they can create mass. You know, I didn't want to get into all that. So I'm just saying it in a kind of way that conveys that in passing, I guess. So any way that you can make people feel like they're just reading something that it's already in the language that they understand, that's what you're going for. You don't want them to be like constantly like, okay, well, this term, and then now building on that, I need to know about this. You know, you want to avoid that. Okay. So 7, describe specific cases in concrete detail to illustrate broader trends. So, so basically, this is something that when I'm setting out to write about something, I almost always have a moment where I'm just like, oh my gosh, I'm overwhelmed by all the different examples and cases, and like this scientist feels slightly different than this one, and you know, and they mentioned this other paper that I haven't, you know, haven't really had time to look at. Like, how will I ever explain everything and put it all into its proper place and context, you know, and give everything its fair airing, you know? And then I have to just remind myself, there's no need to do that. This isn't a review article, you know? This is a story. So you can very, very concisely summarize a huge amount of work by just saying, you know, what can I say? Simple example, you know, dozens of papers have come out exploring different possibilities, you know, that can just say that and it covers this dozens of papers, you know. So describe the most illustrative example or scientist in detail and give concrete details. Again, this kind of show, don't tell aspect. You want to be very kind of, you know, make people feel like they really understand this example. And then kind of let them extrapolate. So show that this fits into a bigger picture, right? There's not a great concise example from the article that I'm talking about, but I just want to mention here, it says, you know, theorists held a workshop to discuss nascent ideas, such as, and give one example, and ways to test them. And then quote from this guy, oh, by the way, he studies this other new idea. Here's a link, you know. So you get the sense, okay, there's a lot of new ideas out there. Here are a couple of them. That's enough. So I think trying to kind of stop yourself from overwhelming people with information is important. Okay, so, and then this is actually my last principle. So yeah, I guess I'm a little short on time, or under time. But so this principle is that strong quotes are key. So, you know, one thing to say about this principle is that I haven't gone into here like how to do the reporting side so much as how to do the writing part. But reporting your article is like, even more important. You have to go out and find out what the story is and find the scientists who are good at explaining things and the ones who have passions and who can tell you pithy things. And so a lot of that is getting better at, asking the right questions, getting them to tell you about their work as a story. So asking like, when does this story start for you? And having them just go through the whole story of their research from what they see as the beginning, and then with questions that will occur to you along the way. But to me, getting good quotes is just super important. You might have noticed a lot of the quotes, or a lot of the excerpts that I've put in from the article I was talking about are quotes from scientists. That's because I see them as kind of the gems of any story. This is proof that I'm not just saying something, that the scientists actually believe this thing, or, it's the facts on the ground in a way. They're also just the best way to convey passions, motivations, tensions. So they're the lifelines from science to the reader. And then one kind of tip is that you can even outline your article sometimes by, like, after you've done all your reporting. And by the way, I would say when I stop reporting is when I feel like scientists are just telling me the same thing as I already know, like kind of repeating what I already know. So then I'm like, I see the outlines of the story now. I can stop. But then at that point, I'll go back through my interviews a lot of the time and just figure out what are the quotes that I want to use. What are the strong quotes? And so I'll pull those out into a document and kind of actually organize them. Like, okay, well, I need to have a section on this, so here are the quotes that can go in that section. Or I even just have just the quotes and then kind of string them together, and figure out how to tell the story that way. So to me, the quotes are really very important. Now, what makes a good, strong quote is that they express opinions, not facts. So I referred to them as the facts on the ground a second ago, but that just meaning this is what the scientists are actually saying, right? But in terms of what you want them to be saying, you want them to be saying what their feelings and thoughts and opinions are. Otherwise, you can probably more concisely express a fact than they did, right? Because you have time to think about it. So don't waste your quotes just like just having the scientist say the factual information. Use quotes for, okay, this is what the scientist felt, right? So the quotes are also colorful and memorable. They're not precise and dry. It's really funny, like oftentimes when, like, anytime scientists do have a problem with a story, like after it's published, it's usually because they spoke a bit cavalierly and then are like embarrassed that they said something a little bit, could be interpreted as like denigrating their colleagues or a certain research area or something. And so they try to ask if it can be made more precise and dry and try to rewrite the quote, and it's like, first of all, we don't do, if you say it's on the record, then we're allowed to quote you. But also it's not understanding what I guess, how readers are reading it. It's like, you want a quote to be the way that humans speak, not just this like very correct statement that has no kind of warmth or color to it, right? So here we already saw this example. I loved this quote, you know, these people are busting their butts and you're pouting like a little kid because you didn't get the lollipop you wanted, right? It's such a good way to say like, shut up, you didn't get a particle, but that's not, you're being silly, right? So it's has a lot of feeling in it. Now this quote's from a different story, but I loved this quote, which is basically talking about constructing these like convoluted models to avoid the fact that the simple models were ruled out by experiment. It's like, you can do it, but you can't show it to your mother with a straight face, you know, like it's something that people understand what it means to go to your mother and show her something, right? So then this one is just kind of someone who really opened up about, you know, their identity and their feeling of throughout their life as a physicist. So I was, you know, as a reporter, I was super happy when someone gives a quote like this that really conveys like how their work kind of coincides with their identity. And then this one I love, it's just such a striking image, this idea of explaining the multiverse and why the multiverse creates so many logical problems, basically with trying to, like, if our universe is in a multiverse and there are infinite other universes, then how do we answer this question of like what was likely to occur in this universe and what isn't, and how do we understand like our place in an infinite spread of possibilities? It's very difficult. I think this was a good way to say it. And then this quote is also from the story that we've looked at, which I think also is just, it's like punchy, short, and it conveys the difference between how the experimentalists were seeing their results from the theorists. And so, yeah, just if you're not planning to be a science writer yourself, but you just want to write about your own research or talk to, you know, journalists, at some point you'll be talking to probably to journalists about your work. These are just the kind of quotes that you want to give them, you know? Be colorful, be opinionated. If you want to actually end up in the piece, you want to talk about things like pithily and colorfully. So yeah, to review, these are the 8 principles that I kind of identified, and I'm sure there could be 8 more if I had more time. So I think I'll stop there and we could see if there are any questions.
Thanks a lot, Natalie. Yeah, we already have a lot of questions already on Slate, but please keep sending me questions and I will communicate them to Natalie. And yeah, I will start with, we have enough time, so it's good that we left enough time for questions. The first one is that you mentioned jargon during the talk, and there are some words like cell or gravity that people will more likely have seen before. But what do you do when your story involves concepts that have not been appropriated by the general public, like the amplitude hadron? What are the most effective ways to move around it?
Yeah, well, so I think amplitude is a case where, first of all, that word is kind of cool and intriguing, right? So you might want to use that word. And secondly, there isn't really any reason to try to come up with your own description because it's such a bizarre, abstract thing that a lot of the point is like, of the piece is like, there's this thing, the amplitude, but what is it? And then explaining, you know, so in that case, I wouldn't avoid the jargon. But I totally agree that there's so many situations where you really just don't know if something is jargon or not. Like, you know, do you have to explain what a photon is? I think sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. I think it's kind of depends on the circumstance. But then with a case where, yeah, there kind of isn't a more colloquial colloquial way to talk about it, you kind of just have to talk about it by name, then yeah, I wouldn't like just, if it's harder to avoid it than it is to use the term, then maybe go ahead. But what's to be avoided is if you're just kind of gratuitously mentioning the name of something or mentioning it instead of explaining it. So like, you know, if scientists are using a type of neural network architecture to like solve their problem, you don't really need to say, oh, the technique they used was convolutional neural nets, and it's called convolut, you know, and that's all I'm going to say about it. It's like, well, then no need to mention it at all. You know, that doesn't really help anyone. And I think a lot of the time with writers, they will just mention the name of something instead of getting into what it is, because it's just easier. Yeah.
That's a great comment. So in general, if you're going to explain it, then you can use it. Otherwise, yeah, there are other words that you could use. That's a great
Yeah.
one. I'll try to go through diverse questions. The next one is about the news hook. You talked about the news hook. How do you recognize which result might end up being a news hook?
Yeah. Well, I think it's hard to be on top of or in front of the news. Like, you know, if there's a paper that's going to be coming out in a month and you heard about it and you know it's a big deal, then you're going to be able to like rush and write your, you know, get your story ready to where then you can launch the story the same day the paper's out and it's amazing and you're like, yay, this is what it's all about. I did it. But then other times it's like you find out about a paper that happened, you know, a few weeks ago because people were talking about it. And so then you feel you're a little bit playing catch up, where you're just rushing to write your story so that it's not like 4 months after the paper came out, you know? But I think in that case, I mean, there's some tricks. Like if a paper came out the same month, but like calendar month, but maybe 3 weeks earlier in the calendar month, I'll just say this month, you know? Sometimes you can even say this year there have been there's been a lot of developments in this area, you know, so you can a little bit stretch it where you're making it sound newsy, because it is newsy, but you know, you don't want to deflate your own story by saying, you know, 3 months ago this paper came out, like, and that's what my story is about, because the reader might think, oh, well, I missed this news and it wasn't that big of a deal anyway because I didn't hear about it, right? So you kind of, in that case, if a paper came out 3 months ago, you would kind of maybe you would just word it differently. And you would try to figure out how to make it sound as new and kind of relevant to the current moment as possible, if that makes sense. Because, and you know, it's not a lie. It's like, as far as the science is concerned, a paper that came out 3 months ago is like, that everyone's talking about. That could be like a newsy situation. So you have to convey why it actually is rather than, and not just deflate your own story. I don't know if that answered the question though.
Well, I think it did. I think, yeah, a lot of us would like, what is a news hook? Because we see so many stages of the process. So I think it's good to hear from you that, yeah, it can be a news hook as long as it's relevant and it's something new that the readers can latch on to.
Yeah, that's well put. Yeah.
So the next question, I guess this is also coming from scientists who will be interviewed themselves. When you're looking to interview scientists for a piece, how do you pick them and how do you approach them?
So usually so say I saw a paper, it seemed interesting, or maybe, you know, saw a talk, and so then, you know, you have the authors of the paper, the person who gave the talk, obviously. But then what I'll do is I'll go to usually go to the references and figure out, you know, who are the authors of the papers that this is citing. If they mention some other theory, you know, that they're this paper is kind of like conflicts with or something, then I would definitely want to interview the authors of that paper. So I use the references a lot to find new people. And then also, you know, gradually you build up a kind of stable of sources that you know are going to give you pithy quotes and also just not even the quotes, but just are very insightful about their research area. So like someone who generally follows everything that happens in you know, superconductivity like research. And so then if I'm doing a story related to some new development there, I'll just call up my source and see what they think about it, because I know they're going to like put it in context. So kind of building up that knowledge over time of who is good to talk to is one way. And then yeah, the authors. I'll also say, you know, I do try to make an effort to find sources who are like diverse women. And it is so hard in physics. It's kind of hard both because there are I mean, it's a problem, just there aren't that many. But then also the female physicists and minority physicists who are out there are just getting constantly asked to help with stuff and contribute, and what, you know, everyone wants to talk to them about stuff. So they're just like super busy and not able to do the work that they want to be doing. So it's hard for both those reasons. And but yeah, so all I can do is make an effort there.
Thanks. Yeah, those were great tips. The next question, I guess, is also coming from a lot of the audience wants to be science educators. And so the question is, how do science education and science communication interplay? And what role does each of those have to promote scientific literacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think to answer the second question, just that they're both so important. But I would say that maybe science education is like even more important, just because, you know, because kids are forced to be in school. And so they are, you know, you have them as this captive audience to try to inculcate with like scientific kind of an outlook, a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Just an analytical kind of way of thinking about things. But then also, yeah, whereas like, you know, if I write an article, it's going to reach people who are already somewhat interested in that subject. So I feel like somehow it's like diminishing returns with actually, you know, the more like each article I write, I don't know, or as an organization like at Quanta, say, I mean, I think we are expanding our audience still, but there's like, ultimately it's going to be hard to reach the people who just don't think at all that they're interested in this stuff. So whereas science education is very much like you have everyone there, just, you know, make them care before they go out into the world. So I think in terms of the overlap, that there is a lot just in the kind of these principles here. I mean, it wouldn't be things like, you know, use strong quotes, because this is not the situation. But I think in terms of teaching people about science as a story, teaching them about it as like a human enterprise, as this like unfinished business, is always going to engage people more than their view of science as kind of this static or dry thing. So
those are great tips. I'm sure a lot of us as science educators will take them. I have two questions. Again, in the interest of time, I will lump them together because they're similar in some ways. So one question is, should generalizations be totally avoided, or do they have a place? And the other question was, what are your tips on the balance between making the subject exciting and encouraging scientists to provide colorful quotes versus sensationalizing it? So not quite the same, but hinting at similar trade-offs.
yeah. I mean, I think that you know, I guess I just feel like the truth itself is exciting, and like I don't necessarily see it as a trade-off, because the scientists themselves, like, they are opinionated, they are passionate. So just kind of drawing them out, you know, is not making them lie, I guess. And so, and then the way that you present it, it's like, again, going back to this story that I've talked about, like, it's not sensationalized, but it's also, you know, it still manages to be exciting, because it's just, if you convey the stakes well enough and the passion well enough, then it is exciting. So you don't have to see it as like this trade-off. I think so often that it's almost like a shortcut to having a story like do well, or, you know, go viral or something, would just be to basically overblow the importance of the study. You know, like, you know, just some paper comes out talking about, like, oh, the, you know, there might be a black hole out in the edge of the solar system, and then it would be like, the coverage would be like, scientists are saying there's a black hole in the, you know, edge of the solar system, like, or it's dangerous, or or we actually found it, or something like that, you know. So kind of trying to drum up excitement, when the actual story might be that they said this thing, but actually everyone else already thinks it's wrong, you know, and that's the truth. So sensationalism is definitely happening all the time in science communication and science journalism. But I guess for me, I guess I don't see it as a trade-off. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll have one final question, and this is a very open-ended question which kind of came about in our discussion today. So feel free to answer it as you will. So the question is there a place for social scientists in science communication?
Oh, I mean, I think that's it's an interesting question. I mean, I guess I feel like the sociology of science is fascinating, and obviously that's a thread that goes through a lot of these points that I've made. It's just that you know, it's a human enterprise. These are people with hopes and dreams, etc. And so, but then also maybe like ulterior motives or bandwagon effects or all these things. And I think, I guess, sorry, I was thinking of this question in terms of like sociologists, not social scientists. So I was thinking like sociology of science is fascinating, and I think like talking, you know, talking about that is fascinating. But in terms of social science, I mean, maybe it would help if you talk about like what types you thought of specifically. I mean, are you talking about like psychology and this sort of thing?
Yeah, I think the question the discussion we were having were around things like anthropology and even economics. I mean, anthropology is definitely at the intersection of social science and science,
Yeah.
but you can go a bit further in, and then you can ask the same questions that you put in the principles of science writing. How much of that applies to social science, and should we be using those principles? Should we be using the same language of uncertainty and all of that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, I wouldn't even necessarily draw the line between like the hard sciences and social science in terms of how you would tell a science story. I mean, I think because you know, if I'm writing about a possible discovery, but it's like the data is only at 3 sigma or something, then, you know, I want to try to quantify that uncertainty. It's like not everything in the hard sciences is black and white. I mean, it's almost never black and white, even like, you know. And so, and I think that's very much true in these softer sciences. Maybe it's more true there. and so the issues of like trying to find the right balance and in how you cover a new result is maybe like, well, it's just also going to be a big consideration. And then also these, again, trying to convey that it's a human endeavor and fallible is maybe even more important in when you're covering social sciences or writing about that, just because there is so much maybe more chance for human error to kind of creep into how things are interpreted. But yeah, I mean, I think if you look in most general interest magazines or newspapers, like they probably have more social science coverage than hard science.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. No, those were great comments. And I guess that's another reminder to share this with social scientists as well. So principles of science slash social science writing. But we're already over time. Thanks a lot to everybody for sticking around. I just wanted to thank you once again, Natalie, for an amazing talk. And
My
thanks for
pleasure.
joining us.
Thanks so much, everyone.